Okay, good morning. Good morning, and thanks to all of you for joining us here today. I'm Trevor Morris, and I'm the dean here at the law school, and it's my pleasure to welcome everyone to today's conference, Antitrust in Developing Countries, Coping with Nationalism, Building Inclusive Growth. We're very pleased to be able to put on this conference here today, which atypically for antitrust conferences, at least in the United States, focuses on developing countries and their needs and challenges, as opposed to just seeing the world through the lens of developed countries. This is an important set of issues, and we're very pleased to play host to this conference, and thanks to all of you for participating. We've been running this event now for a number of years, and it would not be possible without the leadership of my colleagues, Professor Harry First and Professor Eleanor Fox. They and our friends at Concurrence Review have jointly put on this conference. I do want to thank Concurrence and in particular Nicolas Charbit for being here. Where's Nicolas? Not here yet this morning, but he will be here, I suppose. And so thank you all for your leadership in this. We're very pleased about our partnership with Concurrence to be on the cutting edge of competition issues, in particular in this conference, through the eyes of the developing world. I also want to personally thank Professor Joe Stiglitz for being our keynote speaker here this morning, and Eleanor will introduce him and kick the program off. And with that, I will turn things over to Eleanor Fox, a spectacular leader on our faculty and wonderful colleague, Eleanor Fox.
Thank you very much, Trevor. And hello, good morning to all of you. It is a pleasure to add my welcome to all of you. And I want to say just a few words of welcome from colleagues Harry First and Nicolas Charbit and our teams who have done a huge amount to make this happen, the administrative teams and the student teams who are here working on the next edition coming out soon of the Concurrence, which will be on the website of Concurrence very quickly, reporting on this program, having videos of the program, and write-ups of all of the sessions of the program, so look for that. Now, let me just say a couple of words about our keynote speaker and star guest, Professor Joseph Stiglitz. I'm sure you all know that Professor Joseph Stiglitz is one of the most important thinkers on globalization, economic power, growth, developing country, inequities, relationship between the market and the state. He is a pioneer in understanding information economics and information asymmetries, and the fact that that field has caused a fundamental change in understanding market economics and political economy. So among his many distinguished points of his career, he was chair of the Council of Economic Advisors in the mid-1990s. He was chief economist of the World Bank in the late 90s, and he was a bold critic of the IMF for its insensitivity, not listening to the needs of developing countries.
Or to me.
What?
Or to me. They didn't listen to me.
Oh, or to you. But the thing is that now everybody listens to you, and his bold criticism is accepted all over the world. So you were the one, Joe. It did earn him out of a job at the World Bank, we all understand. And it did, the facts behind this criticism of the IMF, the insensitivity to listening to the developing countries' needs, underlies a lot of your book on globalization and its discontents. That's just one of his long list of many famous books. In 2001, he earned the Nobel Prize, and he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics for laying the foundations for the theory of markets with asymmetric information, doing this with George Akerlof and Michael Spence. he has, a list of so many honors. He's been an advisor to presidents, U.S., France, ministers in South Africa, has done a lot of work on markets in Africa. He's chairing and has chaired numerous expert committees on globalization, poverty, inequality, growth, development, economic performance, and social progress. He is now university professor at Columbia. And circling back to the bold criticism of the IMF, that actually leads into exactly this program and what we've been doing for these 5 years on this program. The IMF and World Bank were not listening to the developing countries and their needs. They were assuming at this point in time what's good for the West is good for developing countries. And Joe has been the pioneer to make us listen, and this program is putting on the pedestal the developing countries, and the developed countries sort of play off that rather than the other way around. So we're extremely grateful that you are here today. You see how you really fit in with our project, and now we look forward to your presentation.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Yeah, my engagement in competition policy in developing countries really began when I was at the World Bank, where it was one of the issues that have been neglected previously. The doctrine in the past had been that markets were automatically competitive, and that led the World Bank to make a large number of mistakes, where they would, for instance, get the government, which had been an inefficient agent in marketing boards between farmers and consumers, and say, okay, we'll get rid of the government, and then forget, they believed that markets were automatically competitive. And what happened instead was you had local mafia of one kind or another, market power, monopolists come in. And what they discovered was that, monopolists, private monopolists, were even better at exploiting farmers than the government was. So that things got worse, not better. And one of the campaigns that I had when I was at the World Bank was to encourage them to set up competition authorities. It had only a mild amount of success because there were so many. It was a period of the East Asia crisis, difficulties in managing the transition from communism to a market economy in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. But we did have some successes. What I want to talk about this morning, though, is a more fundamental issue, which is the rethinking that is going on, or should be going on, about antitrust more generally. And in the United States, it's been going on motivated by two things. One, a perception, and I think it's real, that market power has been growing, and that our current legal frameworks have not been able to deal with it. And that this increase in market power is at least one, if not one of the most important sources of the growth of inequality in our economy, and that growth of inequality is one of the sources of a lot of our political and economic problems. At the same time, some of the changes in technology have made it apparent that there are some very big enterprises that have large amounts of market power that are intruding in our lives, and I would say actually represent a larger threat to competition than the large monopolies 100 and some years ago that motivated the antitrust laws. In other words, I'm going to argue that Google and Facebook represent a more serious threat than did Standard Oil and American Tobacco. So what that means is that we need to rethink our antitrust laws. And that process of rethinking is, in a way, begun. Eleanor and I were down at a meeting in Washington of the FTC, one of a whole series of meetings that they're having to rethink antitrust. What will come out of that was not clear. I mean, it was very, let me put it this way, it was very clear that there were, at least at the particular session we were on, at least 30% of the people were really trying to defend the status quo. And I think, while most of the people in our session, in our day, were arguing strongly that we needed a lot of change, I think there was some self-selection, and that they had other sessions where people who all wanted to keep the status quo dominated. So I'll be clear that there are differences of view. Not a surprise, a lot of people who've invested their whole life with a particular intellectual framework don't want to see their human capital wasted. And so they're going to try to do a lot to keep the current framework going because it's their source of living. And I'm at the end of this path, so I have no incentive to keep the status quo. And what I'm going to try to explain, and the younger of you have no incentive to keep the status quo. So I'm going to try to explain to you why you should look at this from a very different perspective. So let me first begin by, as I say, America has a market power problem. And I think the developing countries have even a bigger market problem. And it'll be clear why I think that when I go through and try to describe what has happened to make the problems of market power worse. There's both problems of monopoly, and traditionally antitrust is focused more on monopoly, but now we realize that there are big monopoly problems too, that there are many points where there are channels of buying are also dominated by one or a few firms. And when I say, let me make it clear, when I say monopoly, I use the general terms. It could be one, but it could also be 2 or 3 or 4 firms. So it's not a single firm, it's just market power. And to me, it's evident that the current antitrust and competition laws, as they are enforced and have been interpreted, are not up to the task of ensuring a competitive marketplace. And recent Supreme Court decisions have made it clear that things are even worse than we had hoped. They clearly do not understand some of the key issues. And if we'll have time, I'll talk about the American Express case, which I think typifies the depth of confusion of the majority in the Supreme Court, but also the clarity on some of the people in the minority. That is, that some of the decisions, on some of the dissents really did evidence a real understanding of the economics. There are a number of people who say, well, if we use standard economic tools, there doesn't seem to be evidence of a real problem. And my response to that is if the standard competitive analysis tools don't show that there is a problem, it suggests that something may be wrong with the tools. One of the things I'm going to try to emphasize in parallel discussion is there have been changes in our economy, but there have also been very major changes in economics over the last 30 years. And antitrust law doctrines have not kept pace with either of those two. And in particular, much of the antitrust doctrines, legal doctrines, were predicated on a belief that markets are basically competitive. And I sometimes associate that with the Chicago School, but they don't have a monopoly on bad thinking. And there are people at Harvard who had similar misconceptions and have been very influential in antitrust thinking. So I don't, but I'll sometimes refer to this as the Chicago School because they have the most articulate, the best articulation of the view. But it is a doctrine a set of ideas that is basically rejected by most economists other than those at Chicago. And maybe I should emphasize that one of the ironies is that the very times when a lot of the Chicago doctrines were being embedded in legal decisions in the United States, economists had already rejected those ideas. So it's a real evidence of the kind of lags in thought. So economics was moving on at the very time that a lot of these ideas were being embedded in our legal framework by decisions like in the Supreme Court. So the competitive model is not robust, and by that I mean you just tweak it a little bit and it falls apart. You assume a small amount of information cost, a small amount of transaction costs, a small amount of search costs, and every one of the propositions of standard theory are no longer true. And a theory that is that sensitive to small changes in assumptions is a really bad theory. And yet it is a theory which I believe for ideological reasons has had enormous influence on our society, in our legal framework. So what I'm going to try to do in the limited amount of time is first describe and explain very briefly the growth in market power, and then I'll try describe some of the developments in economic theory that have enhanced our understanding of why there is such market power. And then I'll try to talk about what are the implications of this for new legal frameworks. And at the end, I'll try to be more specific about what the implications are for developing countries. So I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, but I first want to begin by giving a macroeconomic view, because I want to end by also coming back to a macro perspective, that there are broad economic and political consequences of this increase in market power. It reduces opportunity, it creates an unlevel playing field, it has political consequences. The concentration of economic power leads to concentrations of political power. One of the reasons, the original reasons for the antitrust laws, but after that initial period when they were passed, the laws got captured by economists, in a way, and by a particular narrow view of the world, and got narrowly defined in terms of issues like consumer well-being and economic. And even in that, they got it wrong. But they narrowed the sphere, and it was a good revenue generator for economists. Probably nothing has done more for raising incomes in the economics profession other than the development of finance and bad financial products. But it's probably second to Wall Street in generating high income for economists. And I think, as I said before, I think these concerns are now playing out. The failures of competition are showing up in the macroeconomic level with growing inequality, high levels of profits, and yet low levels of investment. Decreased entry and growth of small businesses. We think of the United States as one of the most dynamic economies. You look in the United States, we are actually below average, very low entry. And it's really strange because you have rates of return that are twice what they've been in the past, and entry levels that are really low. Now, I want to emphasize, it's not the only source of these trends, but it's an important one. And there are broader inefficiencies, particularly related to some of the digital monopolies. Since I may not have time to go into this in more detail later, I want to emphasize this, that the standard argument the economists use for the efficiency of the market economy, what's called the first welfare theorem, is based on everybody facing the same price. Because that means everybody has the same marginal cost, the same marginal benefit. And it's the equating of the marginal benefits and marginal cost across the economy that makes for economic efficiency. But what the digital economy has led to the ability to engage in massive price discrimination. So different prices charged to different people. And that undermines the efficiency of the market economy and enables some firms to extract what we call consumer surplus. And profits then are based not on your ability to produce a better product or innovate, but on your ability to extract consumer surplus. And that means that there is more inequality and less innovation. So the lack of competition is evident in many sectors of the economy. Some of it's obvious, and most of this is true in most developing countries: internet, cell phone, cable, airlines, health insurance. And in many cases, the lack of competition has to be assessed at the local level. Like small businesses in many locales only have a source of one or two banks for finance. But often the lack of choice is hidden. Those of you who live in New York think you have many drugstores you can go to, Walgreens or Duane Reade, until you realize that they're just fronts for the same company. So the same company owns a lot of companies, and they can obviously coordinate prices, and there's actually only one or two or three companies. And you have to ask, what was the motivation of this consolidation? And I think it's more than economies of scale and scope, but it has to do with the ability to coordinate prices and exert market power. There's some interesting research recently showing the effect of cross-ownership, which was one of the original concerns of antitrust, that you have this, and showing that cross-ownership seems to have effects on behavior. That's an area of where people are just beginning to do research, and the mechanism by which this is affected is not really clear, but the fact that there are these effects seem to be broadly supported by the empirical literature. There's broad evidence of increase in market power. Many of these areas are contentious, but I think that they're fairly clear. There's data on increased concentration across a wide range of sectors, increased markups in many sectors, and typically, not always, linked to increased concentration. Price discrimination, I mentioned before. In a competitive market, you can't price discriminate. The ability to price discriminate is itself evidence of market power, and it's pervasive. The magnitudes of some of this price discrimination, one person being charged 3 times that of what another person is charged, is really evidence of enormous market power. Finally, at the macroeconomic level, increased share of rents. And this is really one of the most interesting ways of thinking about this. The share of labor has gone down, and particularly if you exclude from the data from CEOs and the bankers, who are not really what we call workers in the usual sense. They're there because they get a W-2. But they're, so you exclude the top 1%. The share of labor has gone down from about 70% of GDP to 75% to down to 60%, an enormous decrease. But what's also interesting is if you look at the share of capital as we would normally understand it, in other words, accumulate the investments in capital, depreciate them, look at a normal risk-adjusted return to capital, and impute what the return to real capital is, the share of capital has actually gone down. Well, if the share of labor has gone down and the share of capital has gone down, where does the rest of the income go? The rest of the income goes to rents. And some of it is land rents, but a significant part of it is monopoly rents. So this is sort of an inferential way, going at backwards, of saying, look, something's going on in our economy that is resulting in, at a very macro level, it's not looking, you guys typically look firm by firm, but this is looking at the big picture that is going on, that is showing up big in the data, that rents are really going up. What is interesting is that this perspective, that there is this large increase in market power, helps explain the growth of inequality, but it also helps explain some of the perverse, peculiar macroeconomic things that are going on, that the high returns to equity that I mentioned before and low levels of investment. Well, if you have an increase in market power, there's a greater discrepancy between marginal and average returns. So average returns can be very high, but with a downward sloping demand curve, with market power, the margin return is lower, and so the incentives for investment are diminished, even though you can have a high average return. It's always been true that firms have strong incentives to engage in anti-competitive practices. So we shouldn't be surprised. And what was interesting is how the Chicago School just ignored this. They said markets are naturally competitive. But if you go back to, Adam Smith, the founder of modern economics, he had this famous quote, "People of the same trade seldom meet together even for merriment and diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public and a contrivance to raise prices." But they not only make profits by taking advantage of their customers, but also by taking advantage of their workers. And another quote that I love is that masters are always and everywhere in a sort of tacit but constant and uniform combination not to raise the wages of labor above the actual rate. Masters, too, sometimes enter into particular combinations to sink the wages of labor even below this rate. These are always conducted with the utmost silence and secrecy. It couldn't have been a better description of the Apple Silicon Valley conspiracy that was uncovered, and finally, they thought they could get away with it. These were the largest firms in America, the most successful firms. They weren't content with their billions of dollars of profits. They had to get together and drive down the wages of those who were the source of the creation of their wealth, their engineers. I mean, it's unbelievable, but that's what they did. And a lot of work,
We want you to leave time for
Okay.
what do you do about it and developing countries' implications.
Yeah, so let me just move quickly. She said I have 10 minutes, but I'm going to go over. I have a little market power on the stage right now, and I'll exercise a little bit of it, okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
And our current business leaders really understand that. Peter Thiel is one of the great in some way, Silicon Valley people said competition is for losers, and Warren Buffett described what he tells his managers to do, that to build bigger moats around his companies, that basically you only make money, and we teach this in our business school, we tell our students, a good idea is not good enough. You have to create market barriers. You have to create anti-competitive frameworks. That's the only way you're going to make money. And there's a good synergy at Columbia between our business school and our economics department, because our economics department is trying to break down the barriers that our business school is trying to create innovative ways of creating them. There are, as we think about the increasing market power, there are multiple forces underlying this. Many of them normal market forces, changes in the structure of demand. And one I want to emphasize is the growth of local services. And that's important because local services, the markets are local, and that links to developing countries. When you have smaller markets, you have the potential for more market power. So the problem that is true in the United States is even more true in developing countries. But also there have been many changes in technology that have given rise to the possibility of more market power, network platform economies, industries with large upfront costs, big data. And the bottom line is to maintain competitive marketplace in the presence of these changes will require a more active competition policy. But I have to also say that I think as I've watched this process over the last 30 years, there's been enormous innovation by American and European companies. They are really innovative in creating new ways of market power. And that's what we, as I say, do at the business school. We try to help them think about how to leverage their market power in ways that keep them out of prison. So I mean, that's really important. We don't want our students to go to prison because we want them to make alumni donations, but we want them to be successful, as we call it, so they can have more money that they can share some of that with our university. So there has been a lot of innovation. Big data has given them more information, innovative contracts, the merchant constraints, like in the GDS case, where I was involved in that, where the only jury trial I've ever been involved in my life, I didn't like it, but we did persuade the jury that these constraints, which were identical to the American Express constraints, were a major anti-competitive constraint, and that was true whether you viewed the market as a one-sided market or a two-sided market. And we anticipated with the Supreme Court framework, conservative judges, that it might go the wrong way, and so we framed our case so that we would win no matter what way they came out. Microsoft was really good in taking some of the new ideas on bundling and nonlinear pricing, the notion of preemptive mergers, merge before they are big enough to be a threat, techniques, particularly in drugs of evergreening, extending the patent life. So these are all aspects of the growth of market power. Let me just mention very briefly the changes in the understanding of economics of the past third of a century. I said the understanding that the competitive model is not a good basis, and that's partly because of information economics, game theory. If you don't have large numbers, even if you don't have a large enough number, either 2 or 3 or 4, you don't get anything near the competitive outcome. Behavioral economics has been an important set of insights to understanding how firms have learned how to exploit others and take advantage. So you can see the role of even in the American Express, MasterCard, Visa, where they allow discounts but don't allow charging. From standard economics, those two are equivalent because it's the relative prices. But they know that markets don't see those as equivalent, and they know, therefore, that the firms won't treat them as equivalent. And therefore, this will have real effects. So the bottom line out of that is all the presumptions based on the old doctrines need to be revisited. Let me just mention 2 aspects of this. The first, that it's important to look at monopsony as well as monopoly. It's important to look at dynamics, the evolution of markets, They've looked at the markets as they are, but not as they will evolve. And that's where preemptive mergers become very important, and some of the other ideas that I'll talk about at their very end. So all this requires a whole new set of presumptions. For instance, new presumptions, new criteria and tools, and new remedies. So if you look, as I look at the abuse, the efficiency defenses, they've really been abused a great deal. And the two-sided market was the worst example of this, because they said, you know, you use the two-sided market, and you said standard analysis doesn't apply. And yet, if you looked at the two-sided market, it had predictions about pricing patterns. If it were a two-sided market, it would have strong predictions about the prices on the two sides of the market. And you can look at empirical evidence, and the prices that they predict are not the prices you see. So you can look at the market and say, oh, you know, there are two sides. There are two sides of a lot of markets, but what you see in the world does not correspond to the predictions of a two-sided market. And yet, the Supreme Court and a lot of other courts did not look at it in this way. So, to me, just to mention some of the presumptions, there's been a strong presumption against predation. That is to say, you have the burden of proof that you have to bear to prove that somebody's engaged in predatory pricing is very high. Whereas to me, I think if you're charging a price below your cost, there should be a presumption of predation. And what is interesting is the marked difference between our trade laws and our competition laws. Our trade laws, which are called fair trade, which are competition, have a totally different standard. If we use those standards, almost all the predation cases would prevail. If you use the antitrust standard, no dumping case would ever prevail. And so we have two parts of our legal framework, both concerned about the same issue, and totally different arguments. And I think, as I say, the presumption should change. I think the presumption about intervening in vertical mergers needs to be changed. In markets where there are imperfect competition, vertical mergers affect the competitive landscape. I think the consumer welfare standard has been misguided. I think we need new approaches to determining market power. The market share approach is an indicator, but in many cases you can get much more direct indicators of market power. If you're charging prices that are multiple of marginal cost, you could only do that with market power. So why look at a lot of indirect indicators when you have a direct indicator? I think some of the simplifications of the past should be viewed as unacceptable, like associated with Illinois Brick. And then finally, we need new remedies, which include both structural policies, breakups, prohibitions against going into downstream or upstream activities, and regulatory policies, non-discrimination, and actually rate setting. And rate setting is what we did in Durbin Amendment on debit cards, their massive antitrust behavior by the debit card companies. But we only did the debit cards. We didn't do the credit cards. And we gave the responsibility for setting the rates to the Federal Reserve, which is basically controlled by the banks. And so what do you think they did? They set the rates at a multiple of marginal cost, a multiple of average cost, a multiple of what they should have been. So we ought to have thought more closely about the institutional arrangements for dealing with it. Well, we need stronger remedies, including, just let me mention one that's been a big issue in the United States, but in other countries. The question in the United States in general, if you legitimately acquire market power, you can do whatever you want. And in Europe, there's abuse of market power doctrines. So this has been most controversial because some people have acquired a monopoly in a drug, even a drug out of patent, and then raised the prices 1,000%. And those, of course, are the kinds of abuses that get real popular reactions. But in developing countries, these are matters of life and death. In the United States, they're redistributive. They give more money to the drug companies, and we all pay higher prices. But when you're a poor country and you don't have the ability to buy the drugs, then it's a matter of life and death. This is going beyond the usual framework, but I want to say the lack of workers' bargaining power is, I think, a competition issue and ought to be dealt within the competition framework. And privacy issues are competition issues. And that, one of the interesting things at the FTC hearing was they made it very clear that they view one of their main mandates now as privacy. And that is going to be one of their challenges going forward. There are some areas where concentration of market power are especially problematic. Finance is one, but another one is media. Because it's not just the concentration of market power in advertising that affects our society, it's the concentration in the marketplace of ideas. And that was one of the things that, you say that the politics was behind the original passage of the antitrust. And if you think about it that way, this should be something that should be of great concern, and I don't think the way we've been looking at it is right. Let me talk finally about some of the specific issues for developing countries. And there are two or three that in particular I want to mention. I think competition can be an effective instrument as part of a broader set of instruments that the government has for pursuing public interest. Public interest in a development country really includes development, but also inequality. And there's been a reluctance by a lot of people to say that's going beyond the remit of competition policy. In every country, but especially in developing countries, the set of tools that you have are very limited. And I think you need to use all the tools in the toolkit. Admittedly, one has to be worried about abuses, and one has to be, worried about that you can keep it within a, you might say, a framework where you could have a rule of law that it won't be abused. But let me just illustrate two or three aspects of that. The first is distribution. Economists have always said, the Chicago economists have said, our job is to make the pie as big as possible. We focus on efficiency. And distribution is handled by politics, that's something else. And in terms of economic theory, that reflects what is called the second welfare theorem. The first welfare theorem was the one that said markets are efficient, and that's only true if you have competition, perfect information, all these things that are not true. But the second welfare theorem said that you can separate out issues of efficiency and issues of distribution. And the second welfare theorem is also not true. That is to say, it's only true under these conditions of perfect information, perfect competition, and even more restrictive mathematical assumptions of convexity and so forth. So no one takes the second welfare theorem seriously outside of Chicago. And that means you can't separate issues of efficiency from distribution. That makes life much more difficult. You know, it would be nice if you could, but you can't. So one has to be, you know, it's not the main tool for addressing inequality, but it is something that you can't ignore. The second thing is, I want to talk about is, when we talk about competition, we have to talk about the whole competitive framework. If people can't get access to credit, you can't have entry. So you can have a lack of competition because individual firms can create barriers to entry, but you can also have a lack of competition because the market isn't functioning well. And part of your job is to try to create a better functioning market. And it may be that competition policy is an instrument for creating a better functioning market. And that's related to the third thing, which I think is obviously central to any developing country, which is development. And competition policy, the ability to have new firms into a market, give new opportunity is both an issue of equality, but also an issue of dynamism. Remember, one of the things I said is dynamism is really important. And competition policy can be an example. So let me just refer to one of the cases I was involved with Dennis here in South Africa, which was the use of South Africa's competition policy when Walmart wanted to come into South Africa. And similar issues arise in many developing countries. It's not a level playing field. You know, a small business can't compete with Walmart. In particular, if Walmart has monopsony power and able to use that monopsony power to get low prices in China, it puts small enterprises in South Africa at a competitive disadvantage. And you can't ignore the market power as a monopsonist in the competitive landscape. So I think the Competition Authority in South Africa used competition law in a creative way where they didn't stop Walmart from coming in the acquisition of Massmart. What they did is to say that you have to help create support in local small firms, African firms, to enter your supply chain. And so they use this in a way to create a more competitive marketplace. And I was in South Africa last November and had a chance to talk to the head of Massmart, who had been forced to do this, and he actually was very happy that it had worked out well. It enhanced it. I don't think they would have done it without the compulsion, and the fact that they needed to be compelled is evidenced by how much work, how strongly they resisted the efforts of the government to make them do this. But in the end, it worked out well. And that just illustrates that the issue before, I think, a competition authority in a developing country is the broader issue is how do we use competition law to create a more competitive landscape in our country. And that's broader than the question in the United States or in an advanced country where you're looking at a particular firm and asking in what ways is it affecting negatively competition in a very narrow area. Okay, let me stop there.
All right, great, thank you. So you have given us an enormous plate for thinking about issues and how we deal with them, both here and in developing countries. And since we're really short on time, this is what I'm going to do, because we were planning to have a discussion period, but we're squeezed. And we can take, let's say, arbitrarily 2 or 3 questions, and they have to be short and to the point, and I'm going to call on 1 or 2 or 3 of you to state your questions before Joe gives any answer, and I'm going to really constrain your time if I have any market power for Joe to answer. And we'll be talking about a lot of these issues throughout the day. So are there those of you, Gönenç?
Hi, this is Gönenç Gürkaynak. Would you say that the digital companies of today are actually the modern day thugs the way some other companies have been in the past, and therefore we shouldn't change our methods of dealing with the antitrust problems posed by them? In other words, do you feel that multi-sidedness, innovation worries, or issues of the ecosystems that are created by these entities being impacted negatively, all of these are actually ways of defending the same thug behavior that has always been there? Or do you think there are merits in some of these worries that warrant a more sophisticated analysis in certain portions of the antitrust realm?
Great question. Now, as I said, I would take one more now and then have Joe answer briefly. Yes.
Morning, Professor Stiglitz. Unlike many of the participants here, I represent the government, and I'm from the government of India. And my question to you is a very simple prescription. We have a competition law which is about 16 years old, and we are in the process of taking up a review. On a generic level, what are the 5 core principles that you would like to see in every competition law for every developing economy, considering what kind of market realities we face and the challenges posed by the digital revolution?
Thank you. Okay, Joe, you have, what do you have, like 2 minutes, 3 minutes, and,
Okay. Well,
and other conversation will just have to be one-to-one.
On the first, I think the digital is a more complex problem. I mean, as I said, I think they are in many ways worse and more invidious than the old antitrust, partly because they have the ability to engage in this price discrimination, which was not a characteristic of the past, and that creates and the big data AI enables that, has the, you might say, a returns to scale that can lead them to be more strongly ensconced than even steel. I mean, we know what happened in steel and auto and all that. We have many producers, and those turned out to be relative to the global economy, many firms, although they're local monopolies in particular. But in the case of big data and AI and the digital companies, there are theoretical reasons for arguing that the more data, the more market power one has. And that may make it more difficult to dislodge them. And that combined with their waking up to the fact that they can engage in what I call these preemptive mergers. That is to say, they're acquiring firms before they reach the threshold that there would be antitrust merger review. And that means there's no threat of, they buy their threats while they're young. And since they know there are a limited number of those, you know, Facebook buying Instagram bought one of the major possible alternative platforms. So the dynamics of the industry seems to be unfolding in ways that, at least for a very long time, they can preserve themselves. Finally, they have another set of issues that we've never faced before, the invasion of our privacy. and the ability to manipulate our politics in a way that we saw. And all of these are aspects of and there's a kind of lack of transparency with the algorithms. So all of these add up to a problem that is of an order of magnitude worse. And yet, we can't divide it like we did in Standard Oil. You know, it's not clear having 5 firms invading our privacy is a better idea than having 1 firm. You know, competition in invading privacy is not the solution. So we are going to need much stronger regulatory frameworks like Europe's GDPR. But as you do that, you start to realize, you know, why one of the reasons that Apple and Facebook may have come out in favor of GDPR is it puts smaller firms at a disadvantage of the compliance costs. So there are a whole set of issues that we're just beginning to think through that make curbing their market power, I think, much more difficult, and we'll need new tools. But yeah, so let me just stop on that. On the other hand, one of the advantages of the new digital is that we get a lot of data. We have more information from which we could, if we use that, be able to detect bad behavior. But I don't know if you remember, just as one other example, the early airline case where they were coordinating action through
Through the early days of the computer.
early
Yes.
days of the computer.
Right.
That they used that in a way that was very hard to detect.
That's right.
And that is going to be another aspect of this new digital world, that they will be inventing ways of coordinating, including, that will be difficult for us to undo. When we find it out, we'll have a better trail, but it may be very, very difficult to detect.
Right.
The question is a really good question of what are the...
A good core principle, it's a really good question, but you have to answer half a minute now, and
Okay.
later, conversation later.
I suppose, let me begin by a negative answer, which is don't copy the U.S. antitrust law and our presumptions and our, our whole standards that we have used. I think what I said at the end, that the challenges of development and maintaining a competitive landscape in a developing country are different than in a developed country. And our laws are not working in the United States, and therefore not going to be working, even less well suited for a developing country. So the issue that I talked about, Walmart, is an issue that India has faced. And if you thought about the impact on your economy of having Walmart displace millions of small enterprises, when the economy has not been able to generate jobs over the last 10 years, the fraction of the ratio of new entrants that they've been able to find formal employment for is very small, means that you really have to think about what would this do to the broader macroeconomic competitive landscape. And so the microeconomic perspective that has been the focus, for a good reason, in the United States, I think is wrong. And the same thing I would say, abuse of market power, using the European standard is, I think, the right one. So I think you ought to look around the world and look at practices that have worked. I also think that the way we go about doing antitrust, prosecuting, is not a good one, except for the lawyers and the economists. somebody put it at the meeting at FTC, that the way we've designed our current antitrust standards in law in the United States is you have to use all your legal, the FTC said it has to use all its legal efforts, all the resources to prove that water is wet. And if you're proving that the water is wet, you don't have any time to do anything that really is about the real anti-competitive actions, whether it's in healthcare or in one area or another. Yeah, okay.
So, thank you. I mean, this has been extraordinary. It leads right into our next panel. I'm going to ask our panelists for the next panel to come up, and first of all, give a big hand to Jeff.